Around 1285 BCE, the sun shone on Syria, and a scene of devastation. A fortified town atop a hill lay under a pall of smoke. Its mud brick walls, crenellated, were chipped by arrow fire, battered by picks, and stained with blood. The city's wooden gate lay trampled and broken, torn down by the axes of a furious army. The soldiers of Egypt, led by their king, Wasmuria Satepnaria, or Ramesses II, had invaded the lands of Syria. Having regained their footing after Kadesh, the royal soldiers counterattacked. In the 8th year of Ramesses' reign, they had marched into northern Canaan, around the Sea of Galilee and neighboring lands. They recorded victories over many towns, bringing forth prisoners whom they subjugated as vassals or took home as captives. Simultaneously, another army marched east, past the Dead Sea, into a land we know as Moab. Now, with victories in the east and the north of Canaan, Ramesses was ready to go further. Within the conquered town, victorious warriors ravaged the populace. Families were rounded up, adults and children both, and taken into captivity. Livestock were gathered to bring southward to Canaan, or perhaps even to Egypt itself. Houses were burned, the hinterland was savaged. According to royal inscriptions, Egyptian troops would attack orchards and vineyards, cutting down trees and ripping vines out by the roots. In the art, Ramesses shows the result of such devastation on the walls of his temples. We see towns depopulated, empty, and despoiled. The Egyptian-Hittite War had entered its most brutal phase, and as Ramesses tells it, the people of Syria would suffer the most. This chapter takes place over 7 years, approximately. In terms of chronology, we are going from regnal year 8 to 15 of Ramesses II. Unfortunately, Ramesses' later wars often lack firm, precise dates. Scholars can reconstruct outlines in the general period, but as with so much of our story, the exact sequence of events is open to some interpretation, and different scholars will give you different versions. With that in mind, here's how it might have happened. Around year 8, perhaps in the same campaign that went to Galilee, Ramesses marched northward to attack a town called Dapur. The attack on Dapur, or Deper in the hieroglyphs, is described at 2 temples, Luxor Temple and the Ramesseum. Here, Ramesses shows himself marching against a Syrian city, and in the hieroglyphs he describes Dapur as being, quote, in the land of Amaru, or alternatively, in the land of Hatti. That reference to Amaru tells us that Dapur was somewhere in southwestern Syria. Unfortunately, the city has not been identified archaeologically. That might be a result of what Ramesses did. On the walls of his temples, we see the king and his soldiers surging forward against the town of Dapur. In one version, the king rides his chariot over his enemies, trampling them underfoot and driving them headlong back towards their city. The city itself sits atop a cluster of hills, and its high walls, studded with crenellations and towers, hold a myriad of defenders who fight back against an Egyptian onslaught. Notably, within this scene, we actually appear to see a siege properly. The Egyptians have brought ladders, which they place against the wall of the town, and their soldiers surge upwards, attacking the enemy directly. On the edges of the walls, some Dapurites are hanging from ropes, as if they are fleeing the battle and trying to get back into their town. The images of the battle show an overwhelming victory, and locals come forth from Dapur carrying offerings, as if begging mercy from the Egyptian army. Unfortunately, they receive none. The attack on Dapur is noteworthy for its timing. Based on other inscriptions, it seems to have occurred in regnal year 8, just a few years after the Battle of Kadesh. Notably, the Hittites had followed up their strategic victory at Kadesh by conquering or subjugating Amaru once more, So Ramesses was very much invading northern territory. Considering what had happened at Kadesh, we may be wondering, what inspired this renewed northern push? Was Ramesses feeling more confident after licking his wounds for a bit? Or had something changed? Curiously, the hieroglyphs describing the Battle of Dapur might give us a clue. In the battle scene, the defenders of Dapur cry out for mercy, and according to Ramesses, they said, quote, "Words spoken by the rebels praising the king. They say, 'Grant us the breath that you give, O good ruler. Behold, we are beneath your two sandals. Dread of you has shattered the land of Hatti, and its ruler has fallen because of your might. We are like a flock of pigs that a lion has hunted. The wretched one of Hatti is fallen because of Ramesses, who scatters the Hittites like chaff before the wind. Breath is taken away from the noses of the rebels. Hatti is restrained." End quote. Within the bluster and chest-pounding, Ramesses drops a bit of geopolitical information. He says that the wretched one of Hatti had fallen. In other words, King Muwatalli II was dead. After 23 years, give or take, the king of the Hatti land had breathed his last. Muwatalli had been a most accomplished ruler. He secured his borders in Anatolia, no mean feat, and he found great success in Syria, where he extended his influence further than any Hittite before. His victory, however, was short-lived, and in death, Muwatalli's influence vanished surprisingly quickly. Following his passing, Muwatalli's son and successor, named Urhi-Teshub, would have a difficult reign indeed. We'll get into that properly in the future because it will be relevant for Ramesses. For now, let's just say that the death of Muwatalli upset the established power balances within the Hittite court. As a result, powerful individuals like Muwatalli's brother, Hattusili, now left their holdings in Syria and went back to Anatolia. That left a power vacuum of sorts, one that Ramesses exploited. With his enemy distracted, the Egyptians pounced. In regnal year 8, Ramesses had marched into northern Canaan. Now, he went further, into Amru and Syria itself. Subsequently, perhaps in the same campaign, Ramesses led his troops deeper into Syria. The next time we hear about them, they attacked a town called Tunip. Again, Tunip is not identified archaeologically, but there are multiple references to it in the written records, especially in the Amarna letters from Dynasty 18. Based on those, Tunip seems to be somewhere north of Kadesh, perhaps halfway between Amru and the Euphrates River. Again, on his temples, Ramesses described an attack on this town, and he specifically calls Tunip the town which is in the land of Naharina. Naharina, or the land between rivers, was the Egyptian term for the Mitanni Empire, which had stretched across what is now eastern Syria and northern Iraq. By Ramesses' day, the Mitanni kingdom had been savaged and reduced, until now it was basically a rump state somewhere east of Euphrates. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But the point is that Tunip, in Syria, had once been part of the Mitanni Empire, and that memory lingered in the time of Ramesses, who described it as being in the land of Naharina. On the walls of his temples, Ramesses recorded an attack on Tunip. Like Dapur, it seemed to involve a siege, followed by conquest and plunder. What is notable about this battle is how Ramesses describes his part in the fighting. On the walls of Luxor Temple and the Ramesseum, we have a passage of hieroglyphs which describe the king himself getting involved in the fight. Apparently, Ramesses led his troops from the front, standing before the walls of Tunip and directing them in the attack. As he tells it, Ramesses did this without wearing any armor, putting himself directly in the firing line in an act of great bravery. The hieroglyphs say, quote, "As Ra lives for me and loves me, and as my father, Atum, favors me, his person, Ramesses, took up his coat of mail to wear only after he had spent 2 hours already standing and attacking the town. He stood in front of his troops and chariots without a coat of mail upon him. His person returned to pick up his coat of armor and put it on, only when he had spent 2 hours attacking the town of the Hittites, the town which is in the region of Naharina. His person, life, prosperity, health, really and truly did it in the presence of his troops and his chariots." End quote. Such a passage may, at first glance, sound like typical Ramessid bluster, but it is noteworthy that he inscribed the same passage on 2 distinct temples, and he seems to have emphasized that this was something that actually happened. And we should probably take it seriously. For all of Ramesses' bombast and grandiosity, it does seem that he, personally, was quite brave and active in warfare. He may not have been the world's finest general, but as a warrior, Ramesses probably held his own. And while we may take this with a grain of salt, Ramesses may have stood in front of the walls of Tunip without armor, but it's possible he wasn't actually in range of enemy bows. Nonetheless, the act of doing so and the display it gave for his troops is consistent with the image Ramesses likes to portray. His inscriptions never proclaim him as a military genius, but they constantly emphasize that he was brave in the fight. You can decide for yourself whether to believe that or not, but Ramesses certainly considered the attack on Tunip quite significant, and such participation may have been wonderful marketing. Beyond the battles of Dapur and Tunip, the historical records become less certain. Artistic scenes at Karnak and Luxor Temple suggest that there were additional campaigns and battles in Syria. Unfortunately, many of these scenes are quite damaged, and the dates for these campaigns are almost entirely lost. Based on the surviving remnants, Ramesses led an army into Lebanon in regnal year 10, and he carved a stela at a site called Nar el-Kelb, or the Dog River. The king had visited this location in regnal year 4, leaving a mark of his passage, and now, in year 10, he added another stela. Subsequently, the artistic scenes indicate that the Egyptian army attacked a town called Mutir, which is possibly the modern town of Mutarieh, about 25 kilometers along the coast from Tripoli. From this and other references, it seems that the Egyptian army marched along the Lebanese coast around year 10, attacking Mutir and other communities in the region. Subsequently, we find the king again attacking towns in Syria, in a region that the Egyptians called Kadesh. Kadesh seems to be a rough term for the lands west of Euphrates, currently dominated by the Hittites, but temporarily vulnerable to Egyptian attack. At Luxor Temple, we have images of the king before a town called Hana, where Ramesses proclaimed that he, quote, shattered Hatti, trampled Kadesh, and slew Naharina. Again, all of these references indicate a campaign deep into Syria. The results of such campaigns are communicated in a curious scene, where we find images of a Syrian town that has been left abandoned and despoiled following an Egyptian attack. Notably, this scene does not include any battle or any troops. It is simply the aftermath of one of these raids. The town, as Ramesses shows it, has been battered. The walls are crumbling with stones falling off. The gate stands askew as if it has been partially pulled down by the troops. Outside, the local trees and orchards have been uprooted, and many of the trees are upside down where the Egyptians have cut and toppled them. It's a most unusual scene in the Egyptian canon. It's not a victory, but rather the aftermath of victory, where the land is abandoned and despoiled by the victorious king. The visual details of these campaigns, such as they survive, are quite remarkable. Unfortunately, a huge amount of historical information has been lost. As you have heard, we have references to many towns and regions, but apart from a couple of dates, year 8 and year 10, we are mostly in the dark. We do not know which regions were attacked when, or how far Ramesses went as he raided into Syria. Scholars like Kenneth Kitchen, Peter Brand, Claude Obsmer, and Anthony Spellinger have done their best to piece the puzzles together, but there are still massive gaps. Based on the scattered references, it appears that Ramesses consistently marched along the coast, heading northward into Lebanon and Ammaru, before turning eastward to penetrate the Syrian heartland. Along the way, he may have dispatched additional armies into the Bekaa Valley and the area around Damascus, what the Egyptians called Upe. Those are referenced briefly in the inscriptions, but we don't get any detail. What about Kadesh? Ramesses' marching routes into northern Canaan and then deep into Syria seem to have consistently circumvented the territory of that city. It appears the pharaoh never tried to attack Kadesh again. Had he learned his lesson from the first attempt, or had he decided that Kadesh simply wasn't worth it? We can only speculate. One interpretation is that, failing to take that city, Ramesses' next campaigns aimed to isolate Kadesh. By raiding deep into Syria, going north and east, Ramesses might cut the Kadeshians off from any Hittite support. Another angle is that Ramesses may have decided Kadesh wasn't worth it. Instead, it was far more profitable to raid into Syria, to plunder their communities. That one might be more likely. In the inscriptions, Ramesses repeatedly mentions the prisoners that he took away and brought back to the Nile Valley. Additionally, we don't get any references to Ramesses conquering Syria. There are no indications that he occupied the region, set up garrisons, or installed governors. Granted, we may have lost the records that tell that, but from the surviving material, it seems that these campaigns were not a war of conquest, but rather grandiose raids deep into enemy territory. With that in mind, it appears that Ramesses was no longer trying to extend his borders north. He would happily raid deep into that region, but hereafter, the Egyptians accepted the territories of northern Lebanon around Byblos and southern Syria around Damascus as the limits of their Canaanite empire. What was the strategic significance of this? Well, that depends on your perspective. Historically, many Egyptologists were quite happy to consider Syria as part of the Egyptian empire. The campaign records of kings like Thutmose I and Thutmose III suggested that they had extended their control deep into this region. More recently, however, a new generation of scholars have been going back to the written record to try to piece together the actual extent of Egyptian influence and administration. Currently, the picture that is emerging is that, generally speaking, Syria was more like a buffer zone rather than a true part of the empire. The local rulers may have paid tribute and given lip service, especially when the kings raided into this area. But whether the Egyptians installed governors and garrisons in the way they had done in Canaan, that is actually surprisingly uncertain. It's quite a large topic with a lot of historiography. Hopefully we can dive deeper into it in the future. But for the sake of Ramesses, it's worth considering. When the king accepted Byblos and Damascus as the northern limits of his control, he wasn't necessarily changing the status quo. Nevertheless, the fact remained that the kingdom of Hatti to the north in Anatolia was a powerful rival for influence in Syria. Ramesses' repeated incursions were a great success in terms of plunder and captives. But as far as we can tell, the king did not try to wrestle this region away from his northern rivals. Instead, Ramesses contented himself with grandiose raids that despoiled the hinterland, destroyed towns, and caused great suffering. It was the sad but significant climax to the Egyptian-Hittite Wars. Through all of this, the battle scenes of Ramesses at Luxor Temple, Karnak, and the Ramesseum have shown chaotic battle before the walls of Syrian towns. One detail that I didn't mention is who accompanied Ramesses on these raids. In battle scenes like Dapur, we often find the king's army led by his sons. Royal princes carrying shields and swords and wearing their distinctive side lock of hair often march into the fray. In the battle for Dapur, for instance, we find 6 royal princes participating in the fight. They are Ha-em-Waset, the king's 4th son, Montu-Her-Kopeshef, the 5th, Amun-Emuya, the 8th, Meri-Atum, the 9th, Seti, or Suteki, the 10th, and Setepenra, the 11th. It is unclear how old these children were at the time. Nor do we know if this is just art or if the sons participated actively in these battles. They might have attended the king symbolically on the campaigns, at least showing their faces on the battlefield as a mark of royal power and prestige. In the art, of course, we see them marching into the fray, where they stab enemies, raise shields against arrows, and even climb ladders to assault the walls directly. Subsequently, in the lists of Canaanite towns, we often find the princes leading captives out from the cities. They beat the enemies with sticks, bind their arms, and then present them to their father. Whether we take this literally or symbolically, it is a significant part of Ramesses' art. Historically, Egyptian kings tended to keep their sons in the background. They did not put them on monuments or show them participating actively in war and governance. There were exceptions to that, but generally speaking, Egyptian princes are invisible. Ramesses really changed that dynamic. Across his monuments, we find the royal sons and daughters appearing publicly and frequently, as if the king was making his growing family a point of pride and display. Naturally, such imagery extended to war, and Ramesses presented his sons as active warriors just like him. It's a remarkable part of his artistic record. If you happen to visit Luxor Temple or the Ramesseum, keep an eye out for the princes with their long sidelocks as they get involved in the fight. Between regnal years 8 and 15, approximately, Ramesses led or dispatched multiple campaigns deep into Syria. The king did not try to occupy or conquer this region. Instead, he satisfied himself with plundering and destruction. Technically, this is part of the Egyptian-Hittite War. The territories of Syria were now vassals to Hatti, and Ramesses was attacking them directly. And yet, the Hittites are curiously absent from this part of the story. A change of kingship in Hatti may have resulted in a power vacuum, and Ramesses seized the opportunity to plunder enemy lands while they were distracted. As they did so, the Egyptians must have wondered, how would Hatti respond? Would they counterattack, leading to another great battle? Surprisingly, no. Within a few years of these raids, the king of Hatti contacted Ramesses, and soon the two empires were discussing peace. But that is a story for the next chapter. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. I hope you are enjoying the show, and if you are, consider sharing it with a friend or leaving a review on your podcast app of choice. Before I go, I would like to thank my supporters on Patreon, especially the priests, who give most generously every month and to whom I am forever in debt. Special thanks to Carlos, Erin, Kate, Erjan, Suyon, Setnacht, James M., Chris, Dan, Cien, Karen, Jean, Jeffrey, James B., Veronica, Daniel, Ashley, Niden, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all far too kind. Thank you so much for your support, and may your lands be free from any raiding. May your neighbors leave your property alone, and where disputes arise, may you emerge unquestionably victorious. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon.